Little girl knocked and cried. "They beaten my mama. Please help." What the rancher did next shocked everyone. Texas territory, April 1889. The wind burned across the empty plains as the last light of the sun sank behind the red hills. A lonely ranch stood in silence, its fences broken by time and dust. John Mercer, a 42-year-old rancher, lived there alone, speaking only to his horse and the wind. He had buried his past years ago, with no family, no laughter, and no reason to hope. But that evening, as the sky turned dark and thunder rolled in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the quiet plains. A knock, soft yet desperate. It came again, faster this time. John froze, his hand tightening on the lamp handle. When he opened the door, a little girl stood there trembling, clothes torn, eyes wide with fear. She whispered, voice shaking like the storm outside. "They beaten my mama. She's dying." The words cut through him like a blade. In that moment, John's quiet world shattered forever. John's hand trembled as he stared at the little girl standing in the cold wind, her voice still echoing in his ears, her tiny frame shaking under the fading light. He could see the terror in her eyes, the kind that only comes from something no child should ever witness. He stepped aside silently, letting her in, the door creaking as he closed it behind them. The fire in the corner flickered weakly, throwing long shadows across the wooden floor. John knelt down, his deep voice gentle yet uncertain, and asked her name. She hesitated before whispering, "Emily." Her lips quivered, and she clutched the edge of her torn dress as if holding herself together. He poured a small cup of water, his rough hands shaking as he handed it to her. She drank slowly, her breathing uneven, then whispered again, "They hurt my mama. She can't move." For a moment, John could hear nothing but the beating of his own heart. The storm outside roared, shaking the windows, and in that sound, he felt something inside him awaken, something he thought was gone forever. He grabbed his old coat from the wall, took his lantern, and opened the door again. The cold air hit them both, sharp as glass. "Show me where," he said quietly. Emily nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and followed him into the night. The wind howled louder now, carrying dust and fear through the empty fields. John lifted her onto his horse, the animal snorting nervously as thunder rolled above. They began to ride, the lantern swinging in his hand, casting fleeting light across the barren land. Emily held onto his arm tightly, her voice trembling as she spoke between sobs. She told him about the men who came to their cabin, how they shouted about land and money, how they pushed her mother when she tried to protect her. "I ran," she said softly. "I didn't know where to go." John's jaw tightened, his eyes hard beneath the shadow of his hat. He knew this land, and he knew the kind of men who claimed it with fists and fear. As they rode through the dark, he could see flashes of lightning cutting across the sky, each one revealing the outline of the distant hills. His thoughts swirled between anger and guilt, anger at what those men had done, and guilt that he had been here, safe, while someone nearby suffered. When they reached the broken fence near the old Miller Trail, Emily pointed ahead. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "There," she said, "behind those trees." John urged the horse forward, heart pounding as they approached a small cabin leaning against the stormlight. The door was open, swaying in the wind, and the silence inside felt heavier than thunder. He helped Emily down, his boots sinking into the wet ground, and stepped toward the cabin threshold. A faint moan came from within, weak and distant. He tightened his grip on the lantern and pushed the door wider, the light trembling across the wooden walls, and there, in the dim glow, he saw her, a woman lying motionless on the floor, her breath shallow, her face pale as dust. The world seemed to stop for a moment as Emily rushed to her mother's side, whispering, "Mama, I brought help." John stood still, the rain starting to fall, his mind caught between fury and sorrow, knowing this night was only the beginning of something that would change them all. John moved closer, his boots creaking against the wooden floor as he checked the woman's pulse, faint but still there. Her breathing was shallow, her face bruised and cold. He looked at Emily, who knelt beside her mother, tears sliding down her dusty cheeks. She clutched her mother's hand tightly, whispering words only a child could speak in such fear. John knew they had to move fast. The storm outside roared louder, the wind pushing against the broken door like a warning. He pulled off his coat, wrapped it around Sarah's frail body, and then lifted her gently onto a small blanket he found near the hearth. The horse neighed restlessly outside, its hooves striking the ground as lightning flashed across the open land. John turned to Emily, his voice calm but firm, telling her to hold the lantern high and not look back. He carried Sarah outside, the rain hitting his face like shards of ice, and placed her carefully on the horse's back before helping Emily climb up behind him. The sky had turned black, the thunder rolling endlessly as if the heavens were mourning too. John grabbed the reins, tightened his grip, and whispered to the horse to move. They rode into the storm, the wind screaming around them, rain soaking their clothes and stinging their skin. The lantern swung wildly in Emily's hand, casting brief flashes of light on the muddy trail ahead. She leaned against John's back, her voice trembling as she tried to speak over the storm. "Those men, they came at night," she said, her words breaking in the wind. "They wanted the land Mama refused to sell. They said it belonged to them now." John's jaw clenched. He didn't need to ask who. She spoke of one tall man with a red scarf and another with a scar on his cheek, names he had not heard in years. Men who once worked for a ruthless rancher east of town, merciless, greedy, the kind who used fear to claim anything they wanted. The horse stumbled briefly as the path grew steep, but John steadied it, his eyes fixed ahead, every muscle tense. The land stretched endlessly, the rain blurring the horizon, but he knew the direction by instinct, every turn carved in his memory from years of solitude. Emily's sobs faded to soft whimpers as exhaustion pulled her down. She clung to him tighter, trusting him completely. Her mother's faint moans were almost lost in the wind, yet they pushed John harder than any storm could. The plains of Texas had seen countless storms, but none as heavy as the one now raging inside him. He felt the weight of justice burning in his chest, a fire he hadn't felt since his own family was taken from him long ago. The thought cut deep, but he didn't let it slow him. They passed broken fences, hollow barns, and silent fields until the outline of the abandoned Miller farm rose through the darkness. It looked like a ghost against the lightning sky, its roof sagging, its walls trembling under the storm. He slowed the horse near the gate, scanning the shadows for movement. There was no sound except the wind crying through the trees. He dismounted, lifted Sarah gently into his arms again, and carried her toward the small shack that still had a roof strong enough to hold out the rain. Emily followed close, her small feet slipping in the mud. John laid Sarah down on a pile of dry hay, covered her with his coat again, and checked her breathing. She stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open for just a second, meeting as before closing again. He looked at Emily, who knelt beside her mother once more, whispering a prayer under her breath. The storm outside began to fade slightly, but the silence that replaced it felt heavier than thunder. John stared into the dark, his mind already on the men who had done this, his heart certain that before the next sunrise they would answer for it. John sat beside Sarah, the dim light from the lantern trembling against the cracked wooden walls as thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He pressed 2 fingers gently against her neck, counting the slow beats that barely met his touch. She was alive, but the life inside her felt fragile, like a candle burning low in the wind. He pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag, tore it in strips, and began to clean the wounds along her arms and face. The blood had dried in dark streaks, the marks of cruelty that made his chest tighten with silent rage. Emily watched every move, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket, her face pale with fear and exhaustion. John met her eyes and spoke softly, steady but firm. "She's gonna make it, I swear." The words hung in the air, part promise, part prayer. He poured a little water into a tin cup and lifted Sarah's head carefully, letting a few drops touch her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, and a weak breath escaped her mouth, but she did not speak. John wrapped her in his coat again, tucking the fabric around her shoulders to keep her warm. The rain had eased outside, yet the silence felt colder than the storm ever did. He stood up, his tall figure casting a shadow that stretched across the floor. His eyes moved to the broken door, the muddy footprints that led from it, and the smashed oil lamp near the wall. Every mark told a story, and every story pointed to the same truth. The men who did this were not strangers. They were local, confident enough to attack and walk away knowing no one would stop them. John's jaw tightened as he reached for his lantern, lifting it toward the door to look outside. The night was still, but his gut told him they weren't far. He turned back to Emily, who had fallen asleep beside her mother, her small hand resting on Sarah's arm. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with tears, yet there was something strong in her even now, a quiet courage that reminded him of someone he once knew. He knelt again, checking Sarah's breathing, then covered both of them with an old blanket before moving toward the window. The sky had cleared slightly, and the moonlight spilled through the cracks in the wood. He could see distant shapes in the valley, faint movements where the land dipped near the dry riverbed. Maybe animals, maybe men. He couldn't be sure, but his instincts whispered danger. He reached for his revolver, not with anger but with the heavy calm of a man who knew what had to be done. His eyes drifted back to the sleeping child, and a thought crossed his mind that he hadn't allowed himself in years. He couldn't let her grow up in a world ruled by fear. Sarah's faint breathing broke his silence again, a sound that carried both pain and hope. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "You'll be safe now." The words steadied him, a promise carved deep into his heart. He poured the last of the water into a small bowl, washed the blood from his hands, and set the lantern low so its flame wouldn't draw attention. He sat in the corner, listening to the soft rhythm of Sarah's breath and the quiet rustle of the wind outside. As the night stretched on, the memory of those two faces, the man with the red scarf and the one with the scar, grew clearer in his mind. He knew their habits, their hiding places, their arrogance. He also knew what kind of justice the sheriff's law could not deliver, the kind that came only when a man faced his own conscience in the dark. With dawn still hours away, John made his decision. He would leave at first light, find those men, and make sure they never laid a hand on another soul again. But for now he stayed where he was, guarding the broken mother and her child as the storm slowly died beyond the plains. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the cabin as John opened his eyes, his mind already set on what had to be done. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Emily or her mother, and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The land was still wet from the storm, and the smell of rain mixed with dust filled his lungs. He saddled his horse without a word, his movements steady, his thoughts sharp. The sky turned gold over the horizon as he rode away, the sound of hooves echoing through the silent plains. Every mile brought back the faces of those men, their laughter, their cruelty, the fear they left behind. He reached the town just as the streets began to stir, the blacksmith lighting his forge, the storekeeper sweeping dust from his doorway. But John didn't stop or look around. He went straight toward the saloon. The wooden doors creaked open, and the smell of whiskey and tobacco spilled out like smoke. The room was filled with the usual noise, cards shuffling, boots scraping. But it all went quiet the moment John stepped inside. Two men sat near the back table, their hats low, their boots on the chairs, laughing over something they thought they'd gotten away with. The taller one wore a red scarf, the other had a scar running down his cheek. They didn't notice him at first, not until his boots struck the floor with slow, measured steps. The laughter faded as the air turned heavy. John stopped in front of them, his eyes locked on theirs. There was no rage on his face, only something colder, a kind of silence that carried the weight of truth. The man with the scar smirked and reached for his drink, pretending calm, but his fingers twitched toward the pistol at his side. John didn't give him the chance. With one swift motion, he kicked the gun off the table, sending it clattering across the floor. The room froze. Even the piano player stopped mid-note. The red-scarfed man stood, his voice shaking slightly, asking if John had lost his mind. John didn't answer. He simply said, "You hurt a woman and left her to die, that's what you did." His tone was low, steady, and it carried through the saloon like a storm about to break. The sheriff, hearing the commotion, entered from the street, his badge glinting in the light. He looked at John, then at the two men, recognizing them instantly. The silence broke when John spoke again, slower this time, his words cutting through the tension. "She's alive, and the girl saw everything." The sheriff's expression hardened as he drew his gun and ordered the men to stand. They argued, shouted about lies and land, but their words meant nothing now. The crowd that had gathered outside the door watched as the sheriff cuffed them, their laughter gone, their pride stripped away. John stood still, his face unreadable, as the sheriff led them out into the dusty street. People whispered, some in shock, others in quiet approval, but no one dared say a word to him. He turned toward the door, gave one last look at the men being pushed into the jailhouse, and then walked away. The sound of his boots on the wooden boards was the only thing left in the air. As he mounted his horse, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint cry of the morning crows. He looked back once, his eyes calm now, but behind that calm was the weight of everything he had done and everything he could never undo. He whispered to himself, "It's over," and rode back toward the open plains where justice had finally found its voice. Days turned into weeks, and the land slowly began to heal just as the people on it did. Sarah regained her strength, her laughter returning softly like the wind through the grass. Emily ran across the ranch each morning, her joy echoing through the open fields, her fear replaced by light. John watched them from the porch, a quiet peace resting in his heart he hadn't felt in years. He taught Emily how to ride, how to guide the horse gently, how to trust the land instead of fearing it. The ranch, once silent and cold, now breathed again with warmth and life. One evening, as the sky burned gold and the cattle moved slowly in the distance, Emily climbed beside him and whispered, "You saved us." John looked at her, his eyes tired but kind, and replied softly, No, little one, you saved me. The dusty wind rose again, carrying their laughter into the endless horizon of the Wild West.